So, the Jane Austen Project, or whatever we end up calling this eventually, starting with Sense and Sensibility. This will be episode 1, from the beginning to through volume 2, chapter 7. I'm not trying to sort of complain after the fact, but I find myself thinking like, man, why didn't we just say stop at volume 1, right at the end of volume 1? It would have made a certain kind of sense, and it would have created a certain kind of cliffhanger that I think I would have enjoyed.
We did get a detail or two that we would have been wanting.
And I know that we were kind of.
I'm trying to remember how volume 1 ended. It ended with Lucy Steele revealing to Eleanor that her fiance is Edward, and we hadn't yet gone to London, so we hadn't learned anything about Willoughby yet. So the cliffhanger would have been about Eleanor.
Well, I mean, in a way, this is a huge, kind of thing. Like there's a couple of pages there, maybe 15 pages, where we suspect this is what's going on.
Yeah.
But this sort of seems to be the big thing. But I know that we picked this this particular reading assignment in part because we were thinking we were going to split this book in half. I might want to talk a little bit about maybe making 3 episodes out of this. This is a slightly bigger chunk than I had expected. And so I might want to see, but I think it's just 2 volumes, so we won't have that easy split at, like, say, the end of a volume.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, there's still a lot of pages left, though.
That's my point.
We're using the Norton edition, edited by Claudia Johnson, which is, I want to just say, like, just a hat tip to Claudia Johnson. If you're interested in reading this book, I would say, the footnotes are really quite good to help you understand some of the slang, some of the references to poets, and political or situational allusions that you don't end up having to Google all the time. She's kind of feeling you as a reader in a way that a good editor does.
I totally agree, and I've begun to dip into the additional material, and I think also well selected. So we'll kind of see where we go, But given that we really only have an hour here, I think we should go ahead and get started.
Okay.
I have kind of 2 things that I want to emphasize, but I don't necessarily want to start with them because they don't really appear until we're well into the reading. So I think we can kind of start. I mean, at the start.
Yeah.
Right. I had a professor years and years ago who very much enjoyed this kind of stuff, and it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't go back and read some Austen frequently. But he had this kind of way of feigning a kind of dismissal, and would call her and writers like her, these floozy-doozy romantic, flossy-dossy. He'd come up with some kind of chiming rhyme about them, and so in some ways, it is this, right? We open up with this household of women. The men are conspicuously absent, either like literally or emotionally or whatever. Like through a lot of this book.
I mean, even John Dashwood in those early chapters is being dominated by his wife.
Right. And so we open up with this household of women, and we have the sort of, I think the first crisis point is the kind of surprise of the will, right? Where
which interestingly we say men are absent. But it's all driven by a man dying.
And then suddenly, this man dies, and then this other man appears, who unfortunately brings a woman with him, right? Who we're obviously not supposed to love. And then it becomes this kind of. I'm just going to sort of say, because I don't know if we really need to go into great detail. I suppose we should talk a little bit about the basic plot that sort of establishes things, but I feel like in a way, right? In part, this is Austen being a victim of her own success, right? That she has invented a thing here that was so successful and so popular and has been copied and replicated and retold in so many varieties that it now sort of feels like a cliche. And I have to keep reminding myself, this is the moment. This was the brand. This was, this was the 1811s, The Matrix, where a bunch of people went, what is this?
Yeah.
This whole new thing. And so that was that, but so we open up with this kind of conflict over, I'm going to embarrass myself, Norcross or North Cross? I've already forgotten.
Norland Park.
Yeah, Norland Park. The sort of fancy estate.
Which is in Sussex,
right?
Which is like this. I love the little map. Like I found myself looking at it a lot.
This is an important detail.
Southeastern. Well, I was like drawing. I was almost Indiana Jonesing it as they move around. I was like do, and be like, wow. They went all the way from Devon to London.
Yeah,
and I was like, that sounds. But then it's like you realize England's not as big as. In a way, this map makes them look further away than they are. But yeah, they're in the southeastern part of England at the beginning. Norland Park is in Sussex. Mm-hmm. And this is where the old man dies and John Dashwood inherits the property. Mm-hmm. And his half-sisters, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, and their mother, therefore, don't get their hands on the. Just a little plot summary, so maybe we should do it, kind of walking through. They're not going to get their hands on the property. Not only that, but the brother's wife talks him out of giving them any real help. Right. So there's financial insecurity at play, and we're clearly not supposed to like Fanny Dashwood, and it seems like in a way she might even be taking some pleasure in. Affecting the insecurity of these women.
Yeah.
Then the day is saved by this knight, I guess, Sir Middleton.
Yeah, Sir John.
Sir John, who lives all the way over in Devon, which from the map we learn is the southwest part of England, invites them to come take a small rental property. And that is the mother and the three sisters, and they do. So that's how they kind of get secure economically. But then there are all these just barely, right. but they're there. They're making it happen. They have their dignity, as it were.
Yeah,
which is important in this book. And then two, they brought nice furniture with them, including Marianne's piano.
Yeah.
And at the center of it all, as many of you probably have seen Sense and Sensibility, or read it, or seen it, or both, and as we knew, even though. I'm starting to think maybe I've never read this one. I think this is my first time with this novel.
I think it is me too.
But not a surprise that romantic tensions in relationships are like all a swirl. Eleanor, the older daughter, Marianne, the middle daughter. There are men they like. There are men that like them, or do they? Everything's shrouded in mystery, and the new men keep coming on the scene. And... there's some definite stuff that gets dropped along the way where we start forming opinions about these guys and these sisters.
Right.
So it's really a romance novel, even though it opens with money as the foundation.
I'm gonna circle back to that because I might argue that it's both. I think the economics of this. I think in some ways what it really is a book about home economics.
Yeah.
But of course, romance and marriage are an essential part of that. Well,
you can't just go marrying anybody.
Parenting, romance, marriage, all of that. Even the way you have your children, as we see in this initial problem with the half brother, and this is Fanny's wedge between John Dashwood and the three sisters, right? Is that they're not really blood.
Yeah,
and she's able to in just literally a couple pages talk him down from what was he going to do,
1,000 pounds?
£1,000 a year.
Yeah, for each girl.
Right, so a 4,000 pound household, which would have been, if we're to believe the footnotes, like they would have been, sitting pretty.
She talks him into giving them nothing.
To like 10 pounds every once in a while when you think about it.
Right.
Kind of thing, if it's convenient.
Yeah.
And one of the ways she's able to do that, right, is she makes the argument that they have to worry about their son and his fortune, right? And as we see later, as this kind of back and forth about marriage and engagement, the young man's fortune is an essential part of it. And so, obviously, we're supposed to not like Fanny, and I will forever love the line. I'm sure I won't find it quickly enough here, but as the Dashwoods are moving out,
she's mad they're taking the furniture.
and not only is she mad, right, but there's this kind of values problem. Where is it? I can't find it right off, but there's a line where she says something like she hated that people of such small means were going to have such nice furniture.
That's right.
Right. And you know, clearly they're not stealing anything. I mean, this is their furniture.
This is their stuff, yeah.
You know, but you know, she's got this very, like, dare I say, 80s Republican style, like, poor people don't deserve nice things kind of attitude.
It's true. And it made all the more rich by the fact that she's the one who has deprived them in the first place.
Right.
And no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the economics of marriage are kind of everything. And in some ways, that tension between Eleanor, who represents sense, and Marianne, who represents sensibility, is hashing that out. That relationship between love and marriage on the one hand and money on the other, because, you know, you start to think, and you have to be careful not to binary the sense and sensibility too much, because,
right,
you know, they have that fight about whether money matters. And because Eleanor,
fantastic
it's
scene,
beautiful dialogue, and you know, because Eleanor represents sense, at first you're like, ooh, Eleanor's going to stand up for money, and she does. She says money matters. And then you're like, oh, rah Marianne, because she's like, I do it for love. And then Eleanor just very slyly is like, well, okay, so, because Marianne says, as long as you have enough money to, like, get by. And Eleanor's like, well, how much do you need to get by? And she says something like, it's like really high.
2,000.
Yeah, like 2,000 pounds would do. Yeah. And Eleanor's like, well, yeah, I guess money doesn't really matter to you, you know. So these categories are quite...
And we see this circle back around with Miss Steele.
Right.
With the question of Edward Farrar,
yeah.
And you know, there's this question of, you know, well, you know, all of these men are paralyzed, right?
Yeah.
The other thing, I'm reminded, there's I can't remember the director's name, but there's this movie from the late 90s, early 2000s called Female Sexual Perversion. That was sort of the art house film that I saw when it came out at the time. And one of the characters is a kleptomaniac, and she's really bothered by the sort of Freudian reading of kleptomaniac as a kind of proxy for sexual, you know, something or other. And she's got this younger sister. The main character, the one who's bothered by all this, is a photographer, and she has this great exhibit of like these women with like iguanas on their heads and just this cool stuff going on. And the sister's looking at it. I'm probably misremembering a lot of this, but what I always remember is the line that the women in the photos are all, you know, by sort of, you know, 21st century American standards fat. And the younger sister is scandalized by this, that these women would let their pictures be taken looking like this, and then just very casually says something like, because that's what happens in a matriarchy, the women get fat, right, because they're in charge, and this is kind of, in an interesting way, and I know not really, but in an interesting way, this place looks like a matriarchy, because you've got all these young men utterly paralyzed, unable to marry, because
their mamas
these
won't let them.
widowed mothers who have all the money are like, well, do what you want. We'll see how it turns out, or do what I want.
Well, and even Willoughby, who's a cad, I guess.
Saying. This is his excuse.
Or
the excuse that people make for him.
It seems to be true that the woman landowner in Devon does have real power over him.
Right.
Like, I guess she's an aunt or something.
Yeah, she's like a spinster aunt who's gonna leave him her estate.
If he behaves.
Yeah, right. And same thing with
certainly Farrar is under his mother's thumb.
You know, and it is a topic of some, you know, conversation, and it is also, I think, true that these sort of mothers wield an extraordinary amount of power, even when I'm hard pressed to think of a mother in the story who's also a little bit ridiculed, right? It's these eldest daughters who are the like Lady Middleton and Eleanor, who I think we're supposed to really hold in high esteem. But there are these mothers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much we're supposed to like Lady Middleton, but I think we're supposed to agree that she has good sense.
Yeah, well, she's not. Her husband is a problem, right? He blabs. He makes jokes about things that are pretty delicate. I see him as sort of a Hugh Hefner character.
Yeah.
Without all the sex.
He's got to have young people around him all the time. Yeah, not just women, but...
And he's teasing, and he's poking, and he's always like, in the... I know you guys are... And he's kind of creating all this controversy because he doesn't really understand how high the stakes are.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm kind of jumping around a bit. But
well, there is one man, and this kind of leads me to a passage I want to celebrate. There is one man who seems to be under no one's thumb. There's probably more than one, but Colonel Brandon is an interesting character. And at this point in the book, it seems like, and I think he's an honest guy, so I think we can say it is true, that up through about chapter 6 of volume 2, he was in love with Marianne, and Marianne didn't want anything to do with him, but he's also developed this real rapport with Eleanor. He's 35, Eleanor is 19, Marianne is 16, and the mother of the Dashwoods is 40. So they have this like wild conversation. In our edition, it's on page 30. When Marianne, first of all, Marianne's hilarious. Second of all, especially after coming off of the Magic Mountain, where I found the dialogue often to be, especially for a modernist novel, so affected and overwrought. Here we have a romantic novelist, yet her dialogue sounds like real people talking.
It's so snappy, and it's so lively.
And this little exchange here, this is Marianne. This is the bottom of 29. At least, Mama, you cannot deny the absurd. So they're talking about Colonel Brandon, who's, again, 35.
Right.
At least, Mama, you cannot deny the absurdity of the accusation that you may think it intentionally ill-natured. Colonel Brandon is certainly younger than Mrs. Jennings, but he is old enough to be my father. That's true, and we need to talk about how it's like appropriate for people to be falling in love with Marianne anyway. But anyway, and if you were ever animated enough to be in love, must have long outlived every sensation of the kind. And then she goes on, it's too ridiculous. When is a man to be safe from such wit, if age and infirmity will not protect him? So Eleanor kind of comes to my rescue. I mean, I'm 50. So at this point, I'm writing in the margins, okay, I feel attacked, Marianne. And Eleanor comes in, infirmity, said Eleanor. Do you call Colonel Brandon infirm? I can easily suppose that his age may appear much greater to you than to my mother, but you can hardly deceive yourself as to having the use of his limb. And Marianne, did you not hear him complain of the rheumatism? And is not that the commonest infirmity of and so they go on in this way. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the whole exchange, like you say, is snappy and hilarious. And then Marianne, who just won't let it go, she says in the middle of the page, a woman of 7 and 20 can never hope to feel or inspire affection again. So there you go, ladies. Now you can feel attacked too. And if her home be uncomfortable or her fortune small, I can suppose that she might bring herself to submit to the offices of a nurse for the sake of the provision and security of a wife.
Right.
Only
a commercial exchange.
Yeah, and Eleanor says, I must object to your dooming Colonel Brandon and his wife, which leads me to believe Eleanor's going to end up with Brandon. Like, I'm just going to guess this. But I must object to your dooming Colonel Brandon and his wife to the constant confinement of a sick chamber merely because he chanced to complain yesterday of a slight rheumatic fever, feel in one of his shoulders. And so, I find all of that to be, first of all, just funny as hell.
Yeah.
And, Marianne rings so true in the way that, like, the young view the middle-aged. At the same time, as you have pointed out, not only are the economic stakes different than the way maybe some of us view marriage today, but it's easy to remember that when Austen was writing this, I guess it just wasn't really that absurd for Brandon to be able to just say in polite company, I love Marianne. Like, if you did that today in the United States, you'd get in trouble, right? Like, Brandon wouldn't be the noble soul. Right. He'd be the creepy
Right.
And Marianne's kind of calling him creepy, right? But at the same time, she's perfectly willing to be in love with Willoughby, who's 25, and that also parents today would flip out.
Right.
And the whole age thing is made further strange by the fact that Eleanor is supposed to be this like huge voice of reason in all of this, and she's 19.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know about you, but like when I was 19, and I don't think I'm alone here, equating me with sense would have been quite the mistake.
Yeah.
So, well, I don't know if Austen's having fun or reflect or holding a mirror up to nature or both. But part of me is reading this saying, okay, humans kind of got it right by pushing the marriage age older. Like I'm on board with 16-year-olds and, you know, not quite being talked about as wives just yet. I don't know what you think about any of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in some ways the book is unconcerned with this.
Yeah.
I think it's normal enough in the early 1800s in this society that I think Austen has some complaints here. But I think they kind of zip past age difference and get more at the kind of fundamental structures of society that allow for this kind of arrangement in the first place.
Yeah.
And part of it is, and this is a thing much on my mind because I feel like we're sort of there. I'm not sure we ever left it, but I feel like I can say with some sense of not being way off base that we're in a bit of a gerontocracy right now, and it feels like this is kind of what's going on here as well.
Yeah.
That, I mean, you know, not to go along with Marianne that these are all old people, but the genuinely old people, you know, they hold all the capital, they hold all the property, and they seem to be exerting an extraordinary amount of influence on how things are going to work. And we're not even bothering to talk about like Parliament, except for the
one
weird,
asshole,
the weird little mention of
Charlotte's
Mr.
husband.
Palmer,
Yeah.
But so I think you know what we really, I think what I believe Jane Austen is setting up in this first volume, and it balances nicely. I wish I had been thinking a little bit more about the volumes when we had thought about this, as I said before. But I think what she's setting up is this situation where these really four girls and women, right, the Dashwoods, seem to fall from this pretty luxurious, pretty kind of like high rank to not so luxurious, not so
more
high
middle
rank.
class.
You know, I mean, they can't afford to keep a carriage and horses.
That's right.
And Eleanor has to kind of be on her mother about this, and
they can't go to parties that aren't within walking distance because they have too much pride to let somebody come pick them up in a carriage.
And this is part of the reason they can't go to London, right? When everyone keeps asking them to visit, is they not only do they not have the basic logistics, but you know, there's all the stuff that goes along with it, the dresses and the, you know.
Well, look what they do in London. They're in London now. They're shopping all the time. And Jennings, you get the impression, is footing the bill for a lot of these shopping excursions.
Right.
I mean, I doubt Eleanor's out here spending money.
Now let's also remember that they're not flat broke.
No.
You know, but you know, they're rich person broke.
Yeah,
right? Is what they are. But so
reminds me a little bit. Sorry to cut you off, but I think we all kind of had a moment with Schitt's Creek. I don't know if you ever watched any of those, where Americans were sort of had a cultural moment through Schitt's Creek, where we were being asked to think about the affable rich broke.
Right.
Obviously, Eugene Levy and Kathleen, what's her last name? I can't remember, but they're both so freaking good.
Yeah.
They make you, and the brother and sister are fabulous, and everyone's great. In a way, the Dashwoods reminded me some of that family, that they still have the high tone falutin sensibilities, but they don't have the capital to back it up anymore.
Right.
You know.
Well, and I mean, this is a kind of an interesting thing. You know, when we think about the relationship of culture and wealth.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's the thing I talk to my grad student friends about. Right. You know, one of the tragedies of graduate education in the humanities, right, is that you are trained into tastes you can't afford.
Yeah.
It's like, you go to a party, of donors, and you can talk about all this stuff, and they're like, well, when did you go to London? And you're like, lady, I'm making like $11,000 a year.
Yeah.
What do you want from me?
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like this is sort of where Eleanor's at.
Yeah.
Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood are like, oh, that would be lovely, and Eleanor's like, hold on, remember all that money we used to have?
Yeah.
But the economics of it, I think, come up in all these interesting ways, and so I think you're dead right. I think Austen sets the stage, right? There's this kind of tragic fall, and we're supposed to see this story initially as, well, do they make the best of it?
Yeah.
Right. And of course, we know from the millions of versions of this plot that we've seen since, we know that part of the lesson is that it's actually better for us to be, this sort of Rousseauian, better for us to be out of this civilization, right? And this poverty, this genteel poverty, is part of,
Well, and the sort of bedrock assumption that Austen contracts with the readers, that while both flawed, Eleanor and Marianne are good people. Like we all sort of enter into a contractual agreement to see them that way. Even I'm not saying she doesn't reveal real character flaws in both young women, but we are pulling for them. The narrative expects us to pull for them. It has us pulling for them, and for that matter, the mother too.
Right.
So when they're banished to that wilderness, we're taking for granted their innate goodness.
Yeah. They're not being punished for some sin. Right. They've been wronged.
Yes.
Right. And part of what gets us on their side is they're like, well, fine.
Yeah.
We'll just deal with this.
Yes.
Right. And it's supposed to be this kind of nobility of character that replaces this nobility of class and wealth and position. I do think, though, along with that stage setting, is, as you point out, the titling, the Sense and Sensibility structure that puts us, thinking about Eleanor and Marianne, and not just them, right? Because we see this throughout. The Mrs. Steeles don't really show a lot of sense.
That's right.
And I might try to circle back to that if I can remember keep the thread together. But I also think there's this kind of, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that Eleanor, I feel like, is making sense of things. Like, it's not just that she's sensible; it's that she makes sense of things.
Yeah.
Marianne doesn't need to, in this incredibly painfully familiar way. I don't know what this means. That here I am, a 50-year-old man, like reading Marianne's bits in Volume 1, especially, and thinking to myself about the embarrassing, childish sort of behaviors, very much like hers. The much too confident self-assurance that I'd figured things out. This business about a man over 27 can't feel love.
Right. This is the big pronouncements.
These kinds of things.
You can't fall in love more than once in your life.
Right. And I think where it really really hit me. It's on 76 on my book. At the bottom, so I think I'm like a page off from you. So it's either 75 or the top of 76 on yours. Okay. But so Marianne has had this mysterious thing with Willoughby.
Right.
They walk in the room. Marianne has run off crying. Willoughby says, "I'm leaving at this moment."
Yes.
Right. And then shortly after, we get this kind of parallel thing where Eleanor begins to suspect. I'm sorry, I'm jumping the gun. We get this issue with Colonel Brandon having to leave.
Yeah. And we find out he has a natural daughter.
Right. Or at least that's what
Jennings says.
That's the rumor, right? Yeah. There's a lot of rumors that don't seem to be fully founded, including the rumor that Willoughby and Marianne are engaged.
Right.
But Brandon has to leave, and Eleanor's reaction is held up as this kind of contrast to Marianne's reaction. Willoughby leaves. Marianne spends a couple of days crying, moping, not eating. Yeah. Things that painfully, I will admit, I did.
Yeah.
About that same age.
Yeah.
That first sort of romantic rejection.
Yeah.
It's almost comical now, but at the time, it is so fundamentally heart-wrenching, right? Eleanor, on the other hand, is very stoic. She's very pragmatic.
In her response to Farrar's treating her
Brandon,
weird, you mean?
Everybody thinks that she's going to be upset because the other rumor is that she and Brandon are getting engaged.
Well, but this business on 76, just to figure out, there is the question of Edward as well on this page, right? Because this is all in a fusion immediate one of spirits, Edward. That I'm on in mine at 76.
Oh, you're right. I had it right. Edward had come to visit, and then he left.
And he leaves without having communicated any affection to Eleanor.
I'm confusing the scenes, because there is the scene with Brandon leaving, but it's, Edward shows up.
Eleanor wants to make sure that everybody sees that she's handling this disappointment.
Right.
She's not wailing.
Yes. And so we get this great kind of narrative moment. It's the bottom of 76 on mine, where Marianne is working this out for herself.
Yeah.
And we get this kind of limited, omniscient, narrator who can kind of poke in when it's convenient.
The narrator has attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is what the narrator tells us. Such behavior as this, so exactly the reverse of her own, appeared no more meritorious to Marianne than her own had seemed faulty to her.
Yeah.
The business of self-command she settled very easily. Here's your narrator, right?
Yeah.
Settled very easily. With strong affections, it was impossible.
Yeah.
With calm ones, it could have no merit. So it's impossible, or it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And so in this way, I think what we're seeing is this worldview that is not just Marianne's, but Marianne is kind of the emblem of this worldview that is, and I'm gonna use this word on purpose, profligate. It is about luxuriating in excess of feeling.
Which, by the way, I think the references to William Cowper and others, but let's not forget, 1811 is not that long after the publication of the Lyrical Ballads.
Exactly, and there's some mention of that.
And I don't know if she mentions Wordsworth, but
it's in the footnote. At least. Yeah.
But I thought about Wordsworth a lot, including this picture. And how Wordsworth and Coleridge, God, I'd have to go all the way back to undergrad, grad school. But I remember what a big deal they made about the excess of feelings, being inspired by a blasted tree or a ruin or a frickin' bird flying across the water.
All the things that
that Marianne feels so strong, and Willoughby encourages this,
and Eleanor to some extent, and that Edward.
I think Eleanor's trying
no.
I think Eleanor's trying to be a little bit less romantic
than
Marianne in the big R sense of the word.
She likes music.
She does.
She finds she and Eleanor, or she and Marianne are walking up to this nice view when they meet Willoughby.
Yeah.
She has her sense. But who is it? Is it Edward, or am I misremembering? Who's the one who's I just don't care about any of that stuff? One of the potential.
I think it might be Edward.
Yeah, who's just kind of that's fine and good for you, but I don't get it.
Because Brandon hasn't done anything yet to make the reader dislike him.
Right.
He's done things to bore Marianne.
Yeah.
He's done things to even annoy Eleanor. But all along, I think Austen is winking at the reader, this is one of the guys.
Yeah.
This is one of the good ones. The girls just don't quite see it yet.
Yeah, I think it's a trap, by the way.
Yeah. It could be.
I think he's not. And I think largely because of the inappropriateness of his attraction to Marianne.
Because of their age?
Because of their age difference.
So you agree?
I do.
Okay.
But I also think that he has been sort of he's been, the word I was going to use was coward, but that's not really the right word. He's been immature in coming at, this is one of the things, and let me circle back to this real quick. Marianne has worked out, right, that managing one's feelings is either impossible or not worth it.
That's right, yeah.
Right? And I feel to a large extent, one of the main projects of this book is to kind of just remind us how just profoundly difficult inner life is. We see Eleanor just carrying this burden. She does the social lies when Marianne won't. She makes excuses for why they can't go to London. She cheers her mother up. She manages all of those kind of like profoundly necessary bits of social lubrication that nobody else in the family is either capable of doing or capable of valuing, even though they're clearly valuable, immensely valuable.
You gotta have them.
And a lot of the problem here is this understanding of the profound difficulty of inner life. That Marianne doesn't think inner life is difficult because she doesn't understand. And again, this is shockingly, grotesquely familiar when I think about my own childhood. She doesn't understand how hard everybody is working. She just thinks some people are this way, some people are that way, and that's just how it worked out.
Yeah.
She doesn't understand all the labor that's going into some of this stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think when we talk about I keep wanting to call him somebody else. When we talk about Colonel Brandon, I think what we see is somebody who's also unwilling, unable, indifferent to that labor of inner life. Here's a grown man using a 19-year-old to pass notes to her 16-year-old sister, essentially, right? Instead of, I'm sorry, you're 35, 40 years old. You walk into a room and you say, I'd like to take you out for a milkshake, little girl. You own it, right?
I think that's fair. I guess we are meant to not like that part of him.
Whatever version is acceptable, like, shall I take you for a ride in my Curus?
Right.
Something. I keep hearing that Bruce Springsteen song in the back of my head now. Whatever the acceptable version of this is, you do it like a grown person does, but he's acting like a child.
He is.
Even as he's pursuing a child.
But he's kind of intimidated by Marianne. And that's interesting.
Again, to his discredit. This dude's in the military? And
he
quails before this. He's independent, right?
Yeah.
To whatever degree he is in charge of himself.
Yeah.
Yet he quails at just like openly talking to a child.
It reminds me a little bit of you quoted Springsteen. I'm thinking of the Bob Seger line. She had been born with a face that would let her get her way.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of what Marianne has on her side, but that also works against her.
She's been allowed to be a child.
It's not to Brandon's credit that he's so intimidated by her, but I think the fact is that he is. And one of the reasons why I think something more akin to a real deal might be slowly happening between Eleanor and Brandon, maybe, is that they're having real conversations. Even though the pretext is bullshit, he's trying to pass notes to the sister, they're getting to know each other a little bit along the way.
But he is missing this.
Yeah.
He's unaware of this.
Not yet.
He's past. He's talking to her like you do that tube at the bank that sucks your thing up. He's not thinking of her as this person
with inner feelings.
Yeah, right. And it's this kind of shortchanging, right? They're like this world is populated by some really selfish morons. Marianne's not the worst of them.
No.
But she's kind of on that team.
Well, she's, it's a problem when you're guided. Like you talked about when you were 16, and certainly I think most of us have been there. It's a rite of passage, and, to be young and to believe that your feelings and your current predicaments are the most important thing in the world. And Eleanor, in a way, I think it speaks very highly of her to be only 19 and able to pull off all that social lubrication that you're talking about. That's, in a way, you might argue she's had to grow up too fast,
right,
because of the way that the mother and the middle sister rely upon her.
Right. And the absence of the father.
And her own feelings, like you say, get shortchanged. In a way, when you think about how Volume 1 ends, this argues for it, because by the time we got to the end of today's reading, we were back to Marianne's heart being broken by Willoughby. But if we had stopped at the end of volume 1,
this would have been all about Eleanor.
Well, the way Austen ends that volume is her way of reminding us, hey, this woman has feelings also.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not just Marianne. You know?
I'm reminded of, I can't remember where I first heard this, but I'm reminded of this thing because I really do feel this terrible sympathy for Eleanor. There's this like older child cliche at play here, right? That she's grown up to care for the others, but I forget where this comes from. I assume it's some sort of therapy cliche or something like that. But it's when you push your feelings down, they don't go away. They're in the basement doing push-ups.
Yeah,
and I suspect we're gonna encounter some of that. Although I'm also not prepared for this book to not provide some sort of happy turnaround before we're done.
I think they're both going to wind up happily married, Marianne and Eleanor.
Something. But the other thing I don't want to end today without bringing up is, along with this kind of intensity of like inner life, this profundity of inner life that we see really being modeled best, I think, with Eleanor, but something that the book is definitely thinking about. I mean, this kind of, it's not quite problem of the mind, but there's some stuff going on about that. The intricacy of everything, right? That Eleanor's always like, you really should be careful. Like, everything requires care.
Yeah.
Right? That you have to be not just aware of yourself, but aware of yourself in context all the time.
And arguably to a fault, she is this way.
Well, although I would say my experience in life has proven that it's probably in the long run better to be Eleanor.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But embedded in all of this, right, is this really interesting to me, sort of, and this is partly just my thing, right? So I'm just prone to see this sometimes when it's not even there, but I think it's here. Embedded in this is this economy, this constant reminder of the economy, and one of the ways it comes out is there's this great doubling. Austen is always using these words that can connote different directions.
Yeah.
And what really stood out to me, and I think there are other examples of this, but this is the moment that it really stood out to me, was page 58 in my book.
Okay.
It's kind of right into chapter 15, and they've just moved to Barton Cottage, and they've met Lady Middleton, who's sort of nice. But there's this kind of just this basic, basic kind of, or I guess they've already met Willoughby, so they've been here for a little while. But there's
actually the pages you're on is when Willoughby this is when he suddenly leaves.
Yeah, that's right. I have to add, will always be welcome, right? And so after he leaves, right, in distress, Marianne had quitted the room. With such a serious quarrel could be most reasonably accounted for, through which she considered what Marianne's love for him was. A quarrel seemed almost impossible. But there's all this language that comes back to the language of economics and property. Yeah. So a couple paragraphs below, it's all very strange, so suddenly to be gone. It seems the work of a moment, and I'm skipping around a little bit. And now, after only 10 minutes' notice, gone too without intending to return, something more than what he owned to us must have happened.
Yeah, now I underlined that too.
She's saying owned up, or something like that, but owned, right? This is about ownership, and we know, 70 pages later, we know that part of this is that he's owned, part of this is that he owns things, right?
And to the extent that engagement is an act of ownership, he's also engaged and owned in that way.
Something more than what he owned to us must have happened, right? Yeah. So to skip down another paragraph or so, right? And it's this is what I believe. They're figuring, they're playing out their stuff. Yeah. There's this classic moment. Here's what I thought happened.
Yeah.
He is moreover aware that she does disapprove the connection. He dares not, therefore, at present confess to his engagement with Marianne, and feels himself obliged from his dependent situation, right? So now we're into the tax forms, the 1040, dependent situation, right? And then this is where it really landed on me. 2 paragraphs later, Marianne is working this out, right? And then she says what she thinks Eleanor would say, right? And then she says, well, what do you say? Eleanor says, nothing, for you have anticipated my answer. And then Marianne goes on, then you would have told me that it might or might not have happened. Oh, Eleanor, how incomprehensible are your feelings. You had rather take evil upon credit.
Upon credit than good,
And so there's this own, there's this dependency, there's this credit, there's this kind of...
Oh, this is the mother accusing Eleanor of this, by the way.
Oh, that's what it is. You're right. Yeah. You're right.
Because she goes on to say, you had rather look out for misery for Marianne and guilt for poor Willoughby.
That's right.
And by the way...
the mother trying to figure out what happened.
And by the way, that turns out to be exactly what happens at the end of today's reading.
Right.
What she's accusing Eleanor of thinking
is the truth.
Eleanor was right. That it's misery for Marianne and guilt for Willoughby. I mean, Willoughby, let's just itemize here. Like, it's a big deal in 1805 or whenever this is set to ask a woman for a lock of her hair.
Right.
I would dare say even today, if you went up to a woman and asked for her hair, she would think it meant you were into her.
There's like a something going on.
I mean, I kind of wish that I'd made that move at some point in my 20s. It's kind of a little bit hot, And he takes the napkin and folds it around, he ends up... but it was all bullshit. Yeah. And then, he writes her these cold-ass letters, and now I'm engaged. I don't know why you even thought that I was into you. Eleanor didn't want to face it, but in a way, Eleanor knew then, in the passage you're highlighting, that this is what was up.
At the same time, I agree with this, but at the same time, this book is replete with examples of women saying, well, I mean, nothing happened, but it did.
Right.
I mean, one of the Miss Steele's
Lucy
says, that she was going to marry
Ferrars.
One of the Ferrars, I forget, or not even that. I think maybe she was going to marry Eleanor's brother. I forget.
Oh, okay.
But Eleanor's like, whoever it is. Eleanor says, really, you that was a thing, and then come to find out, they'd only met like one time.
Right.
There had been no romantic engagement at all. And Lucy's big sort of evidence for her claim is, well, if my mother had approved, if I thought my mother might have approved, I'm sure it would have happened. And so she goes from, I nearly married him, to the, and this is, and it's comical. Right, it's like the stories people tell about, like, I waited in line to get front row tickets, for 17 hours because I knew that once Taylor Swift saw me in the front row, she'd fall in love with me. Or whatever the thing is. It's comically ridiculous. But when we get to the end of today's reading and unpack the truth of it, it is also a fact that Willoughby made no promises.
Well, and Eleanor admits that to herself.
Right.
She's like, my sister's kind of being a bitch.
Well,
like, she's siding with Marianne. Well, she loves Marianne, but I think she's agreeing that Willoughby isn't the only one that led to this disaster.
Well, here's the thing, right? Everybody's like, whoa, ho, ho. And this is part of the reason that I really don't like Middleton, Sir John.
Right.
Because he's constantly shipping everybody around. Oh, I know about you and a certain number, And there's this kind of creepy, like, Burt Reynolds porno director vibe.
Yeah.
Kind of. I don't think that it's actually that bad, but there's this kind of, like, he's kind of up in this business in a way that I think is unhealthy, probably. But everybody, I mean, think of all the times that Eleanor bumps into somebody and they're like, oh, it was so good to hear about your sister's engagement. And she's like, did you though? And so...
Well, to your point, when she reads Marianne's letters, this is on 133. So I guess it's a thing women aren't supposed to write to men they're not engaged to. Writing to someone is a very intimate act.
It's forward.
And Eleanor reads these, like, wildly forward letters from Marianne, and the narrator inserts herself again and says that such letters, so full of affection and confidence, could have been so answered. Eleanor, for Willoughby's sake, would have been unwilling to believe. But her condemnation of him did not blind her to the impropriety of their having been written at all.
Yeah.
And she was silently grieving over the imprudence which had hazarded such unsolicited proofs of tenderness by the event, when Marianne, perceiving that she had finished the letters, observed to her that they contained nothing but what anyone would have written in the same situation. So You're absolutely right that Marianne's hands aren't exactly clean in this kind of Three's Company style misunderstanding of it all.
Well,
and further though, I mean, because I want to say this because something you said sparked a new thought for me. Sometimes, and Shakespeare, if I remember right, is acknowledged an influence on Austen like he is on all British writers, right, at this time.
And is mentioned.
He's mentioned.
They're reading him in Devon.
Am I right in remembering, God, I haven't read this since like I was 22, in The Taming of the Shrew, isn't it true that the sisters, Bianca and the other one, switch? Like the mean one becomes happy wife and the docile one becomes like a top?
I think
like
so.
Dominant?
Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering if Austen isn't setting us up to play a little bit with Eleanor experiencing more sensibility and Marianne experiencing more sense somehow by the end, if that makes sense.
This is the obvious play here, right?
Yeah.
Is that they're chocolate and peanut butter.
Yeah.
And they're gonna like come, they're gonna figure it out. But there's this kind of, I don't know, epistemological thing at work with especially these younger women.
Yeah.
Right? I'm tempted to say like all the single women except Eleanor.
Right.
Where they're like, well, no, we weren't engaged, but we were engaged.
Right.
And
we both knew what was going on.
It's right. It's in the same passage, right around where you were just reading. Right, Eleanor's read the letter where Willoughby seems to be blowing her off.
Yeah.
And hasn't gone back to read the earlier letters that Marianne wrote first. And Eleanor's like, you broke the engagement. Engagement, cried Marianne. There's been no engagement. And this is the first time this is said out loud.
Eleanor exclaims, no engagement.
Yeah. No, he's not so unworthy. So here's Marianne defending. He's not so unworthy. He didn't do that. He wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
He's broken no faith with me. But he told you that he loved you. And here's this almost this Columbo level.
Yeah.
But he told you he loved you. Yes. No. Never absolutely.
Right.
And
I love it so much.
And it is so like so this.
Well, she goes on. She says it was every day implied, but never professedly declared.
Right.
Sometimes I thought it had been, but it never was. I want to defend her here for one moment because I see where you're going. Haven't you ever kind of been there with somebody where it did, like, man, we were doing all the stuff that said I love you, and then but I never said it, and you kind of get tripped up. And some people call that gaslighting. So you might say she's being unfair, but on the other hand, I've totally been where she's at, where I thought things were a certain way, and the person that made me, there were things the person did that palpably made me think she loved me or whatever.
Well, here's the thing. I get you.
Yeah.
Right? But here's the thing. Like, we haven't had access.
Yeah.
Into like, there's never been this moment where Willoughby's like, so what am I supposed to do? I'm in. I didn't mean. I took a left turn somewhere on this.
I mean, he did ask for her hair.
Right. But we haven't had his internal vision, right? But we do know that Marianne's sense of the world is that there's no point trying to manage feelings or be rational.
Yeah.
And so with the limited knowledge I have to put some of this on her because, as the earlier thing I pointed out, I think really stands in the forefront. Like, this is a contract she's talking about. This isn't feelings. This isn't I kind of sort of thought or it really seemed like, right? And then if we want to move it into more modern day stuff, I get you with the gaslighting, but this is also the language that those Me Too men were, well, I mean, I invited her to my hotel room. She came up to my hotel room. Everybody knows what that means. This like unspoken thing can be weaponized in a couple of ways.
Yeah.
And I don't.
And for a woman who's for whom language is so important, Austen herself has got to be here saying, "See, Marianne's kind of immature."
Yeah, she's parsing out. And I'm not trying to say that Marianne is a villain here.
Of course not.
But she is obviously this immature child who shouldn't have been, I don't know, I sort of feel like at some point they gave her a loaded gun.
Yeah.
And she's just too young. Like they should have, somebody should have stepped in. And I don't know who that would have been. Although, this is also just a story about youth.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, who didn't do a version of this.
That's the thing, is she's, like you said at the beginning of today's video, she's relatable to everyone who's ever been. I mean, okay, I can't universalize quite that much, but I think one of the reasons this novel is so loved, I bet, is because people recognize themselves, a little bit of themselves, in both Eleanor and Marianne along the way, you know.
Yeah, and then, you know, in the mix of all of this is Eleanor quietly managing this kind of heart-wrenching thing about Edward,
which we still don't know what is really the truth.
I mean,
she could be being set up for a real heartbreak too.
Right. She feels like she's got it worked out in a way that kind of leans to his credit.
Yeah.
But it feels like she's doing a little bit of what Marianne's doing.
It's some gymnastics.
You know, and
she's also disliking Lucy, I think, a little more than Lucy deserves.
Well,
like, she's like, I'm like, okay, what did Lucy Steele really do that was so bad? Like, and I'm saying even before she revealed her engagement to Ferrars. Like, Eleanor just kind of looked down on her.
She's vulgar.
And I thought that was not my favorite Eleanor moment, you know, or Marianne's moment, because Marianne also looks down on her.
Well, you know, she's pretentious and uneducated, and that's a hard pair to really make peace with sometimes.
Yeah, it is.
You know, and we see the two sisters, they're obviously, like, you know, not supposed to be well liked. I mean, they're not villains, but they're just selfish and superficial. And even Marianne has, like, learned to play piano.
Right.
I mean, she has just some fortitude.
Yeah.
The Steele sisters.
How important is it? Let's talk about that a little bit. Like, does it matter, do you think, in the economics and the value system of the novel, that Eleanor and Marianne are both good artists? Like, what do you think about that?
I think it does. Well, look at how they managed this in Barton Cottage.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think it's fundamental, right? That you know, I mean, what is their occupation? I mean, to bring this back to the language of economics, like, their occupation is to be refined.
Yeah.
Right? And so the way that they demonstrate this refinement, right, is through good taste, good manners, but
also the creation of art.
And some sort of...
Like, Eleanor draws these amazing drawings, and Marianne plays this amazing music.
And it has to do with this kind of expression of something, right? Of perhaps... I mean, I think it's interesting and probably meaningful, and somebody who knows more about the art side of this could probably talk about this better than I could. But I think it's interesting that Marianne, who is this kind of jumble of unmanaged feelings, is the musician.
Yeah.
Right? And Eleanor is, like, drafting out these things that are about, you know, symmetry and planning.
Yeah.
And I know it goes both ways. But it does feel a little bit like, you know, and I don't really know exactly the difference between a piano and a pianoforte. I
don't either. That's something I hoped to look up before today.
And I have to admit, before we're done, throughout this reading, and I'm sure until we're done reading Jane Austen altogether, I'm struggling to sort of keep in the back of my mind that great Keira Knightley SNL sketch, where the you know, early 19th century you know, eligible daughters are all gushing over Mr. Willoughby. Yeah. Except in this version of it, Mr. Willoughby is like a horrible human being. I don't know if you've seen this one.
Yeah.
You know, but they're like, you know, I heard he buggers the stable boy. Oh, Mr. Willoughby. You know, and it's this, you know, condemnation of the sensibility of you know, the old fashionedness of this.
I just think, you know, that Willoughby. I mean, who knows? Like, one of the things I was praising, I want to say this too before we go. Jane Austen's, one of her great talents that I'm celebrating right now is her patience. Mm-hmm. Which is another reason maybe I wish we'd stopped a little early. She inspires impatience in the reader.
Yes.
Like, you want to know what's up with Brandon? Does he have a daughter? Like, what's up with Ferrars? Is he a cat? Is he leading on or on? What's going on with Willoughby? You know, you want to know, is Lucy Steele telling the truth? And Austen's just always restrained. She's like, I know you want to know, but like, first, here's this other thing, right? And she's just very patient with doling out the dirt.
Yeah.
In a way that takes a lot of skill, that I think a lot of people that patterned this later, as you said, a lot of people write these romantic comedies, a lot of people write these feminine setting kind of stories to varying degrees of success.
And it creates this tension that's wonderful.
But her patience, yes, it creates a tension, and so like we still do not know, you know, perhaps something's going to happen that's going to turn Willoughby into a sympathetic character again. Yeah. And maybe it will be all about how Marianne was overly rash. It could be that Brandon turns out to be a dick. And, you know, right now he just looks better. Mm-hmm. It could be that Edward turns out to be really the love of Eleanor's life, or the cad that Lucy's story suggests. Yeah. We just don't know. And so we're going to launch into the next 2 weeks, hopefully learning more. But I think that's, you know, one of the reasons I would recommend this novel to people already, even though I haven't finished it, is it makes you want to keep reading. And that's a lot harder to do than people act like it is, you know.
And it's so lively.
Yeah.
And the interplay, you know, the sort of the bon mots.
Yeah.
You know, it feels very much like I feel like I can see the connections that take us from this to somebody like Noel Coward in the 20th century.
Yeah.
You know, with all these sort of great little figures, you know, in between, not the least of which is, I'm losing my nouns. The playwright, The Importance of Being Earnest. Playwright.
Yeah. Oscar Wilde.
Oscar Wilde. You know, there's a very kind of, obviously not the same, but a very kind of similar feeling, liveliness. I think. And this kind of
had to have influenced Edith Wharton.
Yeah, absolutely. The novel of manners, I guess.
Yeah,
you know,
Henry James,
which a lot of these kind of things are at least bordering on, if not. But yeah. So I think, you know, the only thing to do next is to sort of figure out what we're doing.
Assign ourselves what we want to do next. Yeah, and we'll do that, and we'll